The first bullet shattered the water bottle in Maya Chen's left hand, sending plastic fragments and warm liquid cascading across the concrete floor of the shooting range. The second bullet punched through the steel door behind her, leaving a smoking hole where the exit sign had been just moments before. Maya didn't scream. She had learned long ago that screaming only attracted more attention, more violence, more pain. Instead, she dropped to her knees behind the concrete barrier that separated the cleaning area from the firing lanes, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Preparing and narrating this type of story took U.S. long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The attack had come without warning, like a thunderstorm in a clear sky. One moment Maya had been methodically sweeping brass casings from Lane 7, humming an old Taiwanese lullaby her grandmother used to sing, and the next moment the world had exploded into chaos. The insurgents had breached the perimeter of Forward, operating Base Valor somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, and now the crack of automatic weapons fire echoed through the indoor range like deadly percussion. Maya pressed her back against the cold concrete, feeling the rough texture through her faded green maintenance jumpsuit. At 26, she had spent the last 3 years cleaning this range, collecting spent ammunition, mopping floors stained with gun oil and desert dust, invisible to the soldiers who came here to hone their deadly skills. She was just the quiet Asian woman who appeared before dawn and disappeared after dusk, the one who made sure their weapons ran clean and their practice space remained spotless. Nobody knew that she had once been Captain Maya Xin of the Republic of China Army, that she had earned the highest marksmanship scores in her military academy class, that she could strip and reassemble a rifle blindfolded in under 90 seconds. Nobody knew because she had never told them. The shame of her discharge, not for cowardice, but for refusing to follow an illegal order to fire on civilian protesters, had followed her across the Pacific Ocean like a shadow. Here on this American base, she was simply Maya the range cleaner, Maya who spoke broken English when convenient, Maya who kept her head down and her past buried deeper than the mountains that surrounded this lonely outpost. An explosion rocked the building, and fluorescent lights flickered overhead like dying stars. Through the reinforced windows, Maya could see muzzle flashes painting the twilight in violent orange blooms. The insurgents had coordinated their attack perfectly, hitting during the evening meal when most personnel were gathered in the mess hall. The range was supposed to be empty except for her, but fate had other plans. Contact left. Contact left. The voice belonged to Petty Officer Morrison, a Navy SEAL who had been running night training drills when hell broke loose. Maya had watched him train for months, admiring his fluid movements, his unwavering focus, the way he treated his rifle like a natural extension of his body. Now she could see him through the gap in the concrete barrier, pressed against the far wall with blood seeping through his tactical vest. Morrison wasn't alone. 3 other soldiers had taken refuge in the range staff Sergeant Rodriguez from the 82nd Airborne, whose daughter's photos covered his locker. Corporal Williams, barely 19 and still homesick for his mother's apple pie. And Specialist Brooks, the female combat medic who had sewn up more wounds than she cared to count. They were trapped, outgunned, and running low on ammunition. Maya could hear it in Morrison's voice, see it in the desperate way Rodriguez kept checking his magazine. Another explosion, closer this time. The emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in hellish red. Through the chaos, Maya heard Morrison shouting orders, trying to coordinate their defense against an enemy that seemed to know exactly where they were, exactly how to cut off their escape routes. The insurgents had done their homework, studied the base layout, planned for every contingency except one. They hadn't accounted for the invisible woman who cleaned the range. Maya's hands moved unconsciously to the silver compass her grandfather had given her before she left Taiwan, the one that had guided her family through the mountains during the war, the one that had somehow guided her here to this moment. The metal was warm against her palm, familiar and comforting like a prayer. Her grandfather had been a soldier too, had fought the Japanese during World War II with nothing but courage and determination. A warrior's heart beats strongest in the darkest hour, he had told her. When others run, we stand. When others give up, we fight. The sound of boots on concrete grew louder. The enemy was advancing, room by room, methodically clearing the building. Maya could hear Morrison's breathing, labored and wet. He was hurt worse than he was letting on. Rodriguez had gone quiet, either unconscious or worse. Williams was whispering prayers, or maybe calling for his mother. Brooks was trying to tend to wounds with supplies that were running out as fast as their hope. Through the red-tinged darkness, Maya saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Morrison's sniper rifle, a Remington M24, military grade. Equipped with a Leopold scope, lay just 10 feet away where he had dropped it when shrapnel caught him in the shoulder. The weapon gleamed under the emergency lighting like a promise, like destiny waiting to be claimed. But Maya remained frozen behind her concrete shield, paralyzed not by fear, but by memory. The last time she had held a rifle, the last time she had looked through a scope, had been the day her military career died. The day she had been ordered to fire on her own people, on students protesting government corruption, on young faces that reminded her of her own sister. She had refused, had lowered her weapon, had chosen her conscience over her career. The discharge papers had called it failure to follow lawful orders, but Maya knew the truth. She had been labeled a coward by men who had never faced the impossible choice between duty and decency. Now, in this red-lit hell, surrounded by the sounds of dying men and advancing enemies, Maya faced another impossible choice. She could remain hidden, could survive by staying invisible, could maintain the careful anonymity she had built like armor around her wounded soul. Or she could reach for that rifle, could embrace the warrior she had tried so hard to bury, could risk everything for soldiers who barely knew her name. The decision crystallized in her mind like frost on a window, clear and inevitable. Maya Chen, the range cleaner, might be invisible, but Captain Maya Chen had never learned how to abandon her post. Her grandfather's compass grew warmer in her palm, as if heated by the fire of her ancestors' courage. She began to crawl toward the rifle, her body moving with muscle memory older than shame, deeper than fear. The concrete scraped against her knees, and brass casings scattered under her palms, casings she had collected 1,000 times, from 1,000 practice sessions, in a life that suddenly felt like it had been preparing her for this single moment. Morrison saw her moving, and their eyes met across the chaos. In that brief connection, Maya saw something that stopped her heart recognition, not of Maya the cleaner, but of Maya the soldier. Somehow, in the space between heartbeats, he understood. Without words, without explanation, he knew that the quiet woman who had cleaned his weapons for 3 years was about to save all their lives. The rifle was within reach now, its familiar weight calling to her hands like a lover's touch. But as Maya stretched toward destiny, she heard new voices in the corridor, outside, enemy voices, speaking in accented English, coordinating their final assault on the range. Time was running out, and the ghosts of her past were about to collide with the desperate needs of the present. Maya's fingers brushed the rifle's stock, and electricity seemed to flow through the connection. 3 years of hiding, 3 years of shame, 3 years of pretending to be less than she was, all of it crystallized into this moment of choice. She could feel her grandfather's spirit watching, could hear her grandmother's lullaby mixing with the sound of gunfire, could sense the weight of every decision that had brought her to this place of reckoning. The enemy voices grew closer, and Maya knew that in seconds, everything would change. The invisible woman was about to become visible. The disgraced soldier was about to reclaim her honor, and the range cleaner was about to transform into something far more dangerous, a guardian angel with a sniper's eye and a warrior's heart. But first, she had to answer the question that had haunted her for 3 years. When the moment came to fight or flight, to stand or run, to embrace her true nature or maintain her protective anonymity, who would Maya Chen choose to be? The rifle waited for her answer, and time held its breath. The fluorescent lights above flickered again, casting dancing shadows across the walls lined with safety posters and ammunition storage lockers. Maya remembered painting those walls herself just 6 months ago, remembered the way Morrison had nodded approvingly at her work, the first time any soldier had acknowledged her efforts with something approaching respect. She had been proud of. That nod had carried it with her through weeks of invisible labor, not knowing then that it was the beginning of something larger. During those months of cleaning, Maya had absorbed everything about the soldiers who used this range. She knew Rodriguez saved his daughter's drawings in his vest pocket, knew William still wrote letters home on actual paper because his grandmother didn't trust computers, knew Brooks carried medical supplies even when off duty because she couldn't bear the thought of being unprepared when someone needed help. She knew Morrison practiced the same shooting sequence every Tuesday night, the one he'd learned from his father who'd learned it from his father, a tradition of precision passed down through generations of warriors. Maya had learned their rhythms, their habits, their fears spoken in quiet moments when they thought no one was listening. She had become the keeper of their unguarded truths, the silent witness to their humanity. And now, as bullets chewed through the walls and enemy voices grew closer, all of that careful observation was about to serve a purpose she had never imagined. Her hand closed around the rifle's stock, and the weapon seemed to recognize her touch. The Remington M24 was a perfect instrument of precision, each component engineered for accuracy at impossible distances. Maya had cleaned this specific rifle dozens of times, had memorized its serial number, had noticed the small scratch Morrison had carved into the stock, the initials of a fallen teammate whose memory he carried into every mission. The weight of the weapon transported Maya instantly back to her training days in Taiwan, to morning sessions on the mountain ranges where she had first discovered her gift for seeing what others couldn't see, for placing shots with an accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. Her instructors had called it the sight, that rare combination of steady hands, patient heart, and calculating mind that separated true snipers from merely good marksmen. Maya. Morrison's voice cut through her memories, urgent but controlled. He had managed to prop himself against the wall, his face pale but his eyes sharp. Blood had soaked through his tactical vest, but he was still functional, still thinking tactically. "Can you use that?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Maya met his gaze, and in that moment, the careful fiction of the past 3 years dissolved. There was no point in pretending anymore, no safety in anonymity. When death was hunting through the corridors, Maya nodded once, a sharp military gesture she hadn't used since her discharge. "Then take the shot," Morrison said, and his voice carried the absolute authority of a warrior who had faced death before and learned to make peace with it. "Save my people." Maya's transformation began with her breathing, with the conscious shift from civilian fear to military calm. She had practiced this transition 10,000 times in training, had learned to slow her heartbeat, to quiet her mind, to become the perfect fusion of human will and mechanical precision. Her grandfather's compass pressed against her chest as she moved, a talisman of courage passed down through generations of fighters. She slid the rifle toward the window that overlooked the main courtyard, where she could see muzzle flashes and moving shadows. The enemy had indeed done their homework. They were advancing in coordinated teams, using proper tactical spacing, communicating through hand signals that suggested professional military training. These weren't random insurgents driven by desperation. They were soldiers, disciplined and deadly, and they had come to this base with a specific mission. Maya settled into her shooting position with fluid grace, her body remembering skills that shame had tried to bury. The rifle felt like coming home, like embracing a part of herself she had thought lost forever. Through the scope, the world narrowed to mathematics and wind patterns, to the subtle art of reading distance and calculating trajectory. Everything else, the fear, the guilt, the 3 years of hiding fell away like discarded clothing. The first target appeared in her crosshairs, a bearded man in tactical gear, carrying an AK-47 and moving with the confident stride of someone who believed victory was assured. Through the scope, Maya could see his face clearly, could count the scars on his cheek, could read the determination in his eyes. He was someone's son, someone's father perhaps, fighting for beliefs that might even be justified. But he was also pointing his weapon toward the building where Morrison lay bleeding, where Rodriguez might already be dead, where Williams was praying for his mother and Brooks was trying to save lives with diminishing supplies. Maya's finger found the trigger, and time slowed to the pace of heartbeats. Her breathing steadied, her pulse quieted, and the universe contracted to the space between intention and action. This was the moment she had been running from for 3 years, the choice between the soldier she had been and the ghost she had become. In the scope, the bearded man paused, and Maya saw him smile, a cold expression that spoke of anticipated victory, of enemies about to be eliminated, of a mission nearly complete. It was the smile of someone who had never been surprised by resistance, who had never encountered an enemy they hadn't expected. Maya exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the range like thunder trapped in a cave, and Maya watched through the scope as her target crumpled to the ground with the finality of a door slamming shut. 3 years of civilian life, 3 years of pushing brooms and collecting brass casings, evaporated in the space between trigger pull and impact. The bearded insurgent was dead before he hit the concrete, his confident smile replaced by the empty surprise of someone who had never seen his own mortality approaching. Maya didn't feel the satisfaction she had expected. Instead, a familiar weight settled over her shoulders, the burden of taking a life, even an enemy life, even a life that threatened innocent people. This weight was an old companion, one she remembered from her military service, from the missions that had earned her commendations and nightmares in equal measure. Healing was never easy for Maya Chen, and that difficulty was both her weakness and her strength. "Beautiful shot," Morrison whispered from his position against the wall, and Maya could hear the professional appreciation in his voice. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Maya didn't answer immediately. She was already acquiring her next target, a thin man with nervous eyes who was trying to use the building's shadows for cover. Through the scope, she could see his hands shaking as he gripped his rifle, could read the fear and inexperience written in his posture. He was young, maybe 19 or 20, probably recruited more for desperation than skill. Maya's crosshairs centered on his chest, but her finger hesitated on the trigger dot. In that hesitation lived 3 years of carefully constructed invisibility. 3 years of Maya Chen who cleaned floors and said little and drew no attention to herself. She had built that identity brick by brick, day by day, using anonymity as armor against a world that had judged her and found her wanting. The U.S. military had taken her in as a contractor after her discharge from the Taiwanese Army had given her work that required no security clearance, no background checks beyond the basics, no questions about why a former officer was content to clean weapons she had once carried. Maya's daily routine had become a meditation on invisibility. She arrived at the range each morning at 0500, before the first training sessions began, when the base was still wrapped in the quiet darkness that preceded dawn. She would unlock the building with keys that hung heavy on her belt, would flip the switches that brought the fluorescent lights humming to life, would begin the methodical process of preparing the range for another day of soldiers learning to kill more efficiently. First came the sweeping brass casing scattered across the concrete floors like golden coins dropped by careless gods. Maya had developed a technique for this task, a systematic pattern that ensured no corner was missed, no evidence of the previous day's training remained. She knew which lanes were favored by which units, knew that Rodriguez always used lane 3 because he was left-handed and the angle felt more natural, knew that Morrison preferred lane 7 because the lighting was better for precision work. After sweeping came the mopping, and Maya had learned to read stories in the stains she cleaned. Oil spills that marked where nervous recruits had fumbled with their weapons. Boot prints that traced the paths of seasoned veterans moving with unconscious precision. Watermarks from the bottles that soldiers brought to combat the desert heat that even air conditioning couldn't fully defeat. Each stain was a small history, a moment of human struggle or triumph reduced to something that needed to be erased before the next day's training could begin. The weapon maintenance was Maya's favorite part of her routine, though she was careful never to let this preference show. Soldiers would bring their rifles to the cleaning station, would strip them down to components that Maya would inspect, clean, and reassemble with a precision that bordered on the reverent. She had trained herself to work quickly, efficiently, without the kind of familiarity that might raise questions about her background. But alone in the early morning hours, when no one was watching, Maya would sometimes hold a rifle and remember what it felt like to be a soldier. Her grandfather's compass had guided Maya through those 3 years of deliberate mediocrity, had reminded her daily that hiding was sometimes the most strategic retreat. Chen had been a tactician during World War II, had understood that survival often required patience more than courage, that the best warriors knew when to advance and when to wait. A sword hidden in its sheath is still a sword, he had told Maya during one of their mountain walks when she was young and eager for glory. Sometimes the wise warrior lets the enemy forget she exists. But forgetting herself had been harder than Maya anticipated. In quiet moments during lunch breaks when she ate alone, during evening hours when she returned to her small apartment off base, she would catch glimpses of the officer she had been. Her dress uniform still hung in the closet, pressed and ready, as if waiting for a recall that would never come. Her marksmanship awards gathered dust on a shelf she never looked at. Her service pistol remained locked in a safe, cleaned and maintained but never fired. Maya had tried dating once, had gone to dinner with a civilian contractor who worked in base communications. David was kind, funny, completely ordinary in the way that Maya thought she wanted. He asked safe questions about her work, accepted her vague answers about her past, seemed content with the surface version of Maya Chen that she presented to the world. But when he had asked about her family, about her dreams, about what she wanted from life, Maya had found herself unable to answer. How could she explain that her dreams had died in a moment of moral courage? How could she describe the weight of choosing conscience over career, of being labeled a coward for refusing to fire on innocent people? The date had ended awkwardly, with David sensing the walls Maya had built around herself without understanding their purpose. He had called twice afterward, had left messages that Maya never returned. It wasn't cruelty that kept her silent, but the knowledge that she had nothing to offer someone who lived in the normal world. Someone who had never killed or been asked to kill. Someone who could sleep without checking the locks twice in positioning. Furniture to provide cover from theoretical attacks. Maya's apartment reflected her internal landscape, sparse, functional, ready for rapid departure. She kept 2 suitcases packed at all times, one with clothes and necessities, one with documents and emergency cash. Her grandfather's compass lived on her nightstand, along with a photograph of her family taken before her discharge, when her parents still spoke her name with pride instead of carefully neutral disappointment. Sleep came fitfully for Maya, interrupted by dreams that blended memory and imagination in disturbing combinations. Sometimes she dreamed of the student protesters she had refused to fire upon, saw their young faces twisted with fear as other soldiers carried out the orders Maya had rejected. Sometimes she dreamed of battles she had never fought, of enemies she had never faced, of heroic deaths that might have redeemed the shame she carried like a stone in her chest. But most often, Maya dreamed of shooting. In these dreams, her targets were always clear, always deserving, always threatening people she needed to protect. She would wake from these dreams with her heart racing and her hands steady, as if her unconscious mind was preparing her for a future she couldn't imagine. The dreams had grown more frequent in recent months, more vivid, more insistent, as if some part of her knew that hiding time was running out. Maya's relationship with the soldiers, who used the range, was carefully calibrated to maintain her invisibility. She spoke when spoken to, usually in the broken English she had perfected to seem less threatening, less capable than she actually was. She smiled when appropriate, remained neutral when conversations turned to politics or military strategy, offered no opinions that might reveal the depth of her knowledge or the sharpness of her analysis, but she listened. Maya listened to everything, to Rodriguez's worry about his daughter's struggles in school, to Williams's homesickness and fear of deployment, to Brooks's frustration with medical supply shortages that put lives at risk. She listened to Morrison's quiet conversations with his team leaders, heard the weight of responsibility in his voice when he discussed mission parameters and casualty projections. Maya absorbed their fears and hopes and dreams, carried their stories like small flames in the darkness of her anonymity. Rodriguez had been the first to treat her with genuine kindness rather than mere politeness. He had noticed that Maya always ate lunch alone, had started bringing extra food from the mess hall, had shared stories about his wife and daughter as if Maya were a friend rather than just the cleaning lady. His openness had surprised Maya, had reminded her that kindness existed even in places designed for violence, even among people trained to kill. Williams was homesick in the way that only very young soldiers could be, and he had somehow decided that Maya was safe to talk to about his fears. He would chatter nervously while she cleaned, telling stories about his hometown in Ohio, about his mother's cooking, and his high school girlfriend who wrote letters that smelled like vanilla perfume. Maya had learned to nod at appropriate moments, to make small encouraging sounds that kept Williams talking while revealing nothing about herself. Brooks was harder to read, more guarded, but Maya recognized the signs of someone carrying too much responsibility for other people's lives. The medic worked with a focused intensity that reminded Maya of her own military bearing, and sometimes Maya caught Brooks watching her with curious eyes, as if sensing something beneath the surface that didn't quite match the role Maya was playing. And then there was Morrison, who treated Maya with the kind of professional respect that suggested he saw more than others did. He never talked down to her, never assumed ignorance, never made the casual comments about foreign workers that Maya heard from some soldiers. When he brought his rifle for cleaning, he would sometimes linger, making conversation about weapon maintenance or asking practical questions about range conditions. Maya had learned to answer carefully, sharing just enough knowledge to be helpful without revealing expertise that might raise questions. Now, crouched behind concrete with Morrison's rifle in her hands and his blood staining the floor, all those careful relationships were about to change. The invisible woman was becoming visible. The hidden soldier was stepping back into the light, and Maya Chen was about to discover whether 3 years of invisibility had been preparation or merely postponement. Through the scope, the young insurgent was still trying to find cover, still shaking with fear and inexperience. Maya's finger found the trigger again, and she forced herself to remember that this boy with frightened eyes had come here to kill people she cared about, people whose stories she had been carrying like small treasures in her heart. She exhaled, squeezed, and watched another enemy fall. This time, the weight on her shoulders felt less like burden and more like purpose. The third shot came easier than the second, and Maya recognized the dangerous territory she was entering, the place where taking lives became mechanical, where human targets transformed into problems to be solved rather than people to be mourned. She had walked this path before during her service in Taiwan, had learned to compartmentalize the moral weight of her actions in order to function effectively in combat. But 3 years of civilian life had softened those calluses on her soul, had reminded her that every trigger pull carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Through the scope, Maya could see the insurgent forces regrouping, adapting to the unexpected resistance from the range building. Their initial confidence had given way to professional wariness as they realized they were facing someone with genuine skill rather than panicked civilians. The remaining attackers moved with increased caution now, using better cover, communicating with hand signals that suggested training and discipline. "How many more out there?" Morrison asked, his voice still steady despite the blood loss. He had managed to apply pressure to his wounds, but Maya could see the pallor creeping across his features, could hear the slight breathlessness that indicated shock setting in. Maya swept the scope across the courtyard, counting muzzle flashes and movement patterns. 8, maybe 9 still active, she reported, surprised by how naturally the tactical language flowed from her lips after 3 years of silence. "They're flanking around the south wall, trying to get to the rear entrance. Can you stop them?" The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down by fate itself. Maya had stopped being invisible the moment she picked up the rifle, had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But stopping a flanking maneuver would require her to leave her protected position, to expose herself to return fire, to fully embrace the warrior role she had been hiding from for 3 years. Rodriguez groaned from his position near the ammunition lockers, and Maya saw Brooks crawling toward him with medical supplies clutched in her hands. The medic's face was grim with professional assessment. Rodriguez was hurt badly, would need evacuation soon if he was going to survive. Williams crouched beside them, no longer the homesick boy who talked about his mother's cooking, but a soldier, following Brooks's whispered instructions about pressure points and tourniquets. Maya made her decision with the cold calculation that had once earned her commendations from Taiwanese military command. She couldn't save Rodriguez from her current position, couldn't protect Brooks and Williams if the insurgents flanked successfully, couldn't allow Morrison to bleed out while enemies advanced through corridors he couldn't defend. The math was simple. One sniper in the right position could change everything. "I'm moving to higher ground," Maya announced, her voice carrying the authority she had learned to bury. "There's an observation deck above the ammunition storage room. Better sight lines, overlapping fields of fire." Morrison studied her with eyes that had seen combat across 3 continents, and Maya realized he was making his own calculations about her capabilities and background. "You know building layouts," he observed. "You know tactical terminology. You're not just a range cleaner, are you?" Maya met his gaze directly for the first time in 3 years, letting him see the officer she had been before shame drove her into hiding. "Captain Maya Chen, Republic of China Army, discharged 3 years ago for refusing to follow orders." The words felt like removing armor that had become too heavy to wear. "Marksmanship instructor, long-range reconnaissance specialist. 347 confirmed kills in anti-terrorism operations." The silence that followed her confession was broken by Williams whistling low under his breath. 347? He repeated, staring at Maya as if seeing her for the first time. "Holy shit, ma'am. What kind of orders did you refuse?" Maya's jaw tightened as memories surfaced young faces in protest crowds. Government snipers taking positions on rooftops. RADIO communications ordering her to fire on civilians whose only crime was demanding accountability from their leaders. "The kind that would have made me a murderer instead of a soldier," she said simply. Brooks looked up from Rodriguez's wounds, her hands still working to stop the bleeding, but her attention focused on Maya with new understanding. "That's why you've been hiding here," she said. "You chose your conscience over your career." "And got labeled a coward for it," Maya confirmed, feeling the familiar sting of that particular injustice. "My commanding officers couldn't court-martial me for following the rules of engagement and the laws of war, so they created paperwork. That made me unemployable in any professional military capacity. Morrison's expression shifted as pieces fell into place. Maya's precision with weapon maintenance, her unconscious military bearing during moments of stress, the way she had moved, with the rifle like it was an extension of her body. "But you're still a soldier," he said. "You just needed the right fight." Before Maya could respond, automatic weapons fire erupted from the south corridor, and she could hear boots pounding on concrete as the insurgent flanking team made their push toward the range's rear entrance. Time for conversation had run out. Time for action had arrived with the violence of breaking glass. Maya sprinted toward the stairs leading to the observation deck, her body moving with muscle memory that 3 years of hiding couldn't erase. Behind her, she heard Morrison calling out tactical assessments, heard Brooke shouting medical instructions, heard Williams chambering rounds, with hands that no longer shook with fear but trembled with adrenaline and purpose. The observation deck had been designed for range safety officers to oversee training exercises, but its elevated position and reinforced windows made it perfect for a sniper's nest. Maya settled into position with the fluid grace of someone returning home after a long exile, adjusting the rifle's bipod, calculating distances and wind patterns, preparing to engage multiple targets in rapid succession. Through the scope, Maya could see the insurgent flanking team advancing with professional discipline, 4 men moving in tactical formation, covering each other's movements, communicating through hand signals that suggested extensive training. These weren't desperate amateurs driven by ideology. They were soldiers, possibly special forces, possibly mercenaries, definitely dangerous in ways that demanded respect. The team leader was a scarred man with lieutenant's insignia sewn hastily onto civilian tactical gear, and Maya recognized the type, former military turned insurgent, carrying professional skills into civilian conflicts, where rules of engagement became guidelines and war crimes became tactical options. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never been outfought, never been surprised, never encountered resistance he couldn't overcome through superior firepower and ruthless efficiency. Maya's first shot took him center mass, and she watched through the scope as his expression shifted from confidence to shock to the empty surprise of someone discovering that death had been walking beside him all along. He dropped without a word, and his team immediately went into combat mode, seeking cover, returning suppressive fire, trying to identify the sniper's position, while maintaining their advance toward the building's rear entrance. But Maya was already moving, already acquiring her second target, already thinking 3 moves ahead in the deadly chess game that combat had become. Her grandfather's tactical lessons flowed through her mind like water finding its course. Never stay in one position after firing. Never assume the enemy lacks skill. Never underestimate the value of patience in warfare. The second insurgent tried to use his team leader's body as cover, and Maya put a round through his shoulder that spun him into the open, where Williams, who had somehow made it to a rear window, finished the job with his service rifle. The young soldier from Ohio was learning war in real time, transforming from homesick boy to combat veteran in the space. Between heartbeats, Maya's third shot missed. The insurgent had anticipated it, had thrown himself behind a concrete barrier just as she squeezed the trigger. The round sparked off concrete instead of flesh, and Maya cursed her impatience. 3 years away from combat had cost her the edge she had once taken for granted, had introduced hesitation and second-guessing into calculations that used to be as automatic as breathing. The missed shot revealed her position to the remaining insurgents, and Maya found herself under accurate return fire from multiple directions. Bullets shattered the observation deck windows, sending glass fragments cascading around her like deadly rain. She rolled away from her firing position, feeling concrete chips sting her face as enemy rounds chewed through her former cover. From below, Maya could hear Brooks coordinating with Williams, trying to establish a crossfire that would prevent the insurgents from reaching the building's interior. Rodriguez was still down, still bleeding. but conscious enough to call out enemy positions to his teammates. Morrison was providing tactical guidance despite his wounds, turning their desperate defense into something approaching coordinated military action. Maya found a new position behind steel filing cabinets that offered protection from direct fire, while maintaining sight lines to the courtyard. Through the scope, she could see 2 insurgents still active, both taking cover behind a damaged Humvee that someone had abandoned during the initial attack. They were trying to coordinate their own flanking maneuver, attempting to use the vehicle as mobile cover while advancing toward the building. But Maya had noticed something. The insurgents had missed a fuel leak from the Humvee's damaged tank, diesel spreading in a dark pool beneath the vehicle that caught the emergency lighting like Black Mirror. One tracer round placed correctly could turn their cover into their crematorium. Maya lined up the shot with mathematical precision, calculating the angle needed to skip around off concrete and into the fuel pool. The physics were complex: bullet trajectory, ricochet angle, ignition probability. But Maya had always excelled at the intersection of science and violence that made precision shooting possible. She exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger, and watched physics transform into fire. The round sparked off concrete exactly as calculated, ignited the diesel exactly as planned, and turned the Humvee into a funeral pyre that consumed both remaining insurgents before they could scream. Maya didn't watch them burn. She was already scanning for additional threats, already calculating the next phase of the engagement, already thinking like the tactical officer she had tried so hard not to be. But the courtyard was finally quiet, except for the crackling of flames and the distant sound of helicopters approaching, reinforcements arriving, too late to affect the outcome, but in time to witness its aftermath. "All targets neutralized," Maya reported, her voice carrying across the range with the authority of someone who had reclaimed her identity through violence. "Building secure." Morrison's response came weak but clear. "Outstanding work, Captain." The title hit Maya like a physical blow, carrying weight she had thought lost forever. For 3 years, she had been Maya the Cleaner, Maya the Invisible, Maya the Disgraced. But in the space of 10 minutes, she had become Captain Chen again. Had proven that shame couldn't erase skill, that hiding couldn't diminish courage, that the warrior's heart her grandfather had spoken of could survive even the deepest disgrace. But as the adrenaline began to fade and the reality of what had happened settled over her like dust, Maya realized that reclaiming her identity had come with a price. She could never go back to invisibility now, could never return to the safe anonymity that had protected her from judgment and questions, and the weight of expectations she had failed to meet once before. Brooks was the first to reach the observation deck, climbing the stairs with medical supplies and expression of professional concern mixed with something approaching awe. Maya was sitting with her back against the wall, Morrison's rifle across her knees, staring out at the courtyard where smoke still rose from the burning Humvee like an offering to gods of war. "Rodriguez is stable," Brooks reported, kneeling beside Maya with the automatic assessment of someone trained to evaluate trauma. "Williams is shaken but uninjured. Morrison needs evacuation, but he'll make it." She paused, studying Maya's face with the careful attention she usually reserved for battlefield injuries. "What about you, Captain?" Maya looked down at her hands, surprised to see them steady despite everything that had happened. The rifle felt natural in her grip, familiar as her own heartbeat, but she could also feel the weight of every shot she had taken, every life she had ended, every choice that had brought her to this moment of reckoning. "I don't know," Maya answered honestly. "I thought I knew who I was, thought I had made peace with being invisible. But tonight, ... She gestured toward the windows, toward the evidence of violence that had transformed her from ghost back into warrior. "Tonight I remembered what it feels like to protect people instead of hiding from them." Brooks sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough to avoid crowding. Maya recognized the medic's technique. She had probably comforted hundreds of soldiers dealing with the aftermath of combat, had learned to navigate the complex emotions that followed violence, even when that violence was necessary and justified. "You saved our lives," Brooks said simply. "Whatever happened in your past, whatever brought you here, tonight you were exactly who we needed you to be." Maya's throat tightened with emotion she had been suppressing for 3 years. Pride and shame, relief and terror, vindication and uncertainty, all of it swirled together in a cocktail of feeling that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. She had saved lives tonight, had proven that her skills remained sharp despite years of disuse, had demonstrated that choosing conscience over orders hadn't diminished her effectiveness as a soldier, but she had also revealed herself completely, had destroyed the protective anonymity that had allowed her to function in a world that had judged her and found her wanting. Tomorrow there would be questions, investigations, paperwork that would expose every detail of her past. The comfortable invisibility of Maya, the range cleaner, was gone forever, replaced by the complicated visibility of Captain Chen, the disgraced hero. Helicopters were landing in the courtyard now, their rotors whipping smoke and debris into spiraling clouds that painted the night in shades of gray and gold. Medical teams would stabilize Rodriguez and Morrison. Intelligence officers would begin investigating how insurgents had penetrated base security, and eventually someone would want to know everything about the mysterious range cleaner who had single-handedly ended a coordinated attack. Maya closed her eyes and felt her grandfather's compass warm against her chest, carrying the weight of family history and military tradition into this moment of transformation. Lei Chun had fought his war in mountain forests with bolt-action rifles and determination, had chosen sides based on principle rather than politics, had understood that sometimes the right choice was also the hardest choice. "He would be proud," Maya whispered, thinking of the old man who had taught her to shoot, who had shared stories of warfare and courage during long walks through Taiwanese mountains, who had given her the compass that had guided her through 3 years of exile and back to herself. Who would be proud? Brooks asked gently. "My grandfather. He was a soldier too, fought the Japanese during World War II. He taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of fear. Choosing to stand when standing is hard." Maya opened her eyes and looked at Brooks, seeing understanding in the medic's expression. "I've been running from myself for 3 years, afraid that one moment of moral courage made me a coward. But tonight, tonight you proved that doing the right thing takes more courage than following orders," Brooks finished. "You proved that conscience and capability aren't mutually exclusive." Through the shattered windows, Maya could see Morrison being loaded onto a stretcher, conscious and alert despite his injuries. Williams was helping the medics, his boyish face serious with new understanding of mortality and heroism. Rodriguez was sitting up under his own power, talking animatedly with investigators who were already beginning to piece together the night's events. Maya stood slowly, feeling muscles protest after the sustained tension of combat. The rifle felt heavier now, weighted with significance beyond its physical mass. This weapon had been her tool of redemption, her instrument of reclamation, but it had also been her declaration of war against the comfortable powerlessness she had cultivated for 3 years. "What happens now?" Maya asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Brooks smiled, and Maya saw respect in her expression, not the careful politeness she had received as a cleaner, but the genuine regard one warrior offered another. "Now you stop hiding," Brooks said. "Now you remember what it means to be Captain Maya Chun." The sound of her rank spoken with respect rather than disappointment made Maya's chest tight with emotion she had thought buried too deep to resurrect. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of disgrace like a stone in her heart, had convinced herself that choosing conscience over orders made her unworthy of the uniform she had once worn with pride. But tonight had proven that worthiness. couldn't be taken away by bureaucrats or politicians or commanding officers who prioritized obedience over ethics. Worthiness was earned through action, demonstrated through courage, proven through the willingness to risk everything for people who mattered. Maya had earned her rank through skill and dedication, had proven her worth through choices that cost. Her everything but her soul. The investigators would want her story, would demand explanations for skills that seemed inconsistent with her employment records. Maya would tell them the truth, all of it, from her military service to her discharge, from her reasons for hiding to her decision to fight. She would face their questions without shame, would answer their doubts with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally made peace with her own choices. More importantly, Maya would have to decide what came next. The range cleaner identity was gone, burned away in muzzle flashes and enemy blood. Captain Chen was visible again, exposed to a world that would judge her actions through the lens of politics and prejudice and institutional self-protection. Maya would have to navigate that world without the armor of anonymity, would have to stand on her own merits rather than hiding in plain sight. But as Maya looked out at the courtyard, where smoke still rose from the burning Humvee, where medics worked to save lives and investigators worked to understand how 9 insurgents had been stopped by one woman with a borrowed rifle, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: pride. Not the false pride of hidden superiority, but the genuine satisfaction of someone who had faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious. Maya Chen had stopped running from herself. Captain Chen was ready to face whatever came next. The debriefing room in the base headquarters building felt smaller than Maya remembered from her brief visits 3 years ago, when she had first arrived as a contractor seeking invisible work that required no explanations. The fluorescent lights hummed with the same mechanical persistence as the range, but here they illuminated uncomfortable metal chairs, recording equipment, and the carefully neutral faces of military intelligence officers who had spent the last 6 hours trying to understand how their security had been breached, and their personnel saved by a woman they had thought was merely a janitor. Colonel Sarah Martinez, base commander, sat across from Maya with a file folder thick enough to represent a career rather than a single incident. Maya recognized the type: career officer, combat veteran, someone who had earned her position through competence rather than politics. Martinez's gray hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her uniform carried ribbons that spoke of deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and places that probably didn't appear on public records. "Captain Chen," Martinez began, and Maya felt that familiar jolt of electricity that came with hearing her rank spoken by someone who understood its weight. "We've spent the morning reviewing your service record from the Republic of China Army, your discharge circumstances, and your employment here as a civilian contractor. What we're trying to understand is why someone with your qualifications chose to work as a range cleaner for 3 years." Maya had expected this question, had prepared for it during the sleepless hours since the attack, but speaking the truth aloud still felt like removing armor she had worn for so long it had become part of her skin. "Because I was ashamed, ma'am. I refused orders to fire on civilian protesters and got labeled a coward for choosing conscience over compliance. When you carry that kind of stigma, invisibility becomes a survival strategy." Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the intelligence officer who had been leading the investigation, leaned forward with the focused attention of someone trained to read between lines. "According to the Taiwanese military records, you were one of their most decorated snipers. Marksmanship instructor, counterterrorism specialist, multiple commendations for operations that remain classified. What exactly were you ordered to do that was worth throwing away that kind of career?" Maya closed her eyes, and the memories came flooding back with the clarity of photographs developed in blood and moral certainty. Student protesters filling university squares, their young faces bright with the kind of idealism that threatened corrupt officials. Government snipers taking positions on rooftops around the demonstration, Radio communications crackling with orders that violated every principle of military honor and human decency. "Fire on unarmed students," Maya said simply. My commanding officer ordered designated marksmen to eliminate protest leaders, to create enough casualties to justify declaring martial law. I was positioned with a clear shot on a 19-year-old girl who was leading chants about government accountability. She looked like my younger sister. The silence that followed her words was heavy with the weight of understanding. These were professional soldiers, people who had faced their own moral tests in combat zones, where the line between enemy and civilian often blurred beyond recognition. They understood the weight of orders that asked soldiers to choose between obedience and humanity. "You refused the order," Martinez said, and Maya heard no judgment in her voice, only the careful neutrality of someone making official records. I lowered my weapon and declared the target inappropriate under rules of engagement, Maya confirmed. Other snipers carried out their orders. 7 students died, including the girl I was supposed to kill. The government declared the protests a terrorist action, arrested hundreds of people, and used the incident to justify expanded security powers. Harrison made notes on his tablet, but his expression suggested personal rather than professional interest in Maya's story. "How did your superiors respond to your refusal?" Maya's jaw tightened as she remembered the aftermath, the emergency hearings, the careful paperwork that painted her refusal as cowardice rather than principle, the bureaucratic assassination of her character that made her unemployable in any professional military capacity. "They couldn't court-martial me for following international law, so they created a discharge classification that made me a pariah." Failure to follow lawful orders was the official language, but everyone understood the real message. I was unreliable, untrustworthy, someone who would prioritize personal ethics over military discipline. "But the orders weren't lawful," Martinez observed. "Firing on peaceful protesters violates multiple international treaties that Taiwan has signed." "Truth and bureaucracy don't always align, ma'am," Maya replied. "My commanding officers needed a scapegoat for their own illegal orders, and I provided a convenient target. The official story became that I was too weak to do what was necessary for national security." Captain David Kim, the base intelligence officer who had been quietly observing the conversation, spoke for the first time since the debriefing began. "So you came to America seeking work that wouldn't require explanations about your military background?" Maya nodded. "The U.S. military was willing to hire me as a contractor for non-sensitive positions. Range maintenance required security clearance below the level where my discharge classification would raise questions. I could work with weapons without carrying them, could be around soldiers without having to explain why I was no longer one of them." "You were hiding in plain sight," Harrison said, and Maya heard understanding rather than criticism in his assessment. "For 3 years, yes. I told myself I was being practical, finding work that matched my circumstances. But really I was running from who I used to be, afraid that one moment of moral courage had proven I wasn't really a soldier." Martinez closed the file folder and leaned back in her chair, studying Maya with the careful assessment of someone making decisions that would affect careers and lives. "Captain Chen, I've read the after-action reports from last night. According to Petty Officer Morrison, you engaged 9 insurgents with precision and tactical awareness that prevented what could have been a massacre. Your shooting was flawless. Your tactical decisions were sound, and your courage was unquestionable." Maya felt something loosening in her chest, a knot of shame and self-doubt that had been tightening for 3 years. "I did what needed to be done, ma'am. Those people, Rodriguez, Williams, Brooks, Morrison, they weren't just soldiers to me. I had watched them train, had listened to their stories, had come to care about them. When they were threatened, the choice was easy." "The choice was the same choice you made 3 years ago," Kim observed. "Protecting innocent people, even when authority figures ordered you to do otherwise. The only difference was that last night, protecting innocent people aligned with military objectives. The observation hit Maya like a physical blow, reframing. 3 years of self-doubt with sudden clarity. She had been consistent, not cowardly, had always chosen to protect rather than harm, to preserve life rather than take it unnecessarily. The circumstances had changed, but her fundamental character had remained constant. "There's something else," Martinez said, opening another folder that Maya hadn't noticed before. "We've been investigating how the insurgents knew exactly where to attack, how they had such detailed knowledge of base layout and security procedures. The intelligence suggests this was an inside job. Someone provided them with information that made their attack possible." Maya felt ice forming in her stomach as the implications became clear. Someone on the base had betrayed their colleagues, had provided enemy forces with the intelligence needed to kill American soldiers. The attack hadn't been random terrorism, it had been calculated murder, planned by someone who wore the same uniform as the people they had tried to kill. "During your 3 years here," Harrison continued, "you had access to every part of the base as part of your maintenance duties. You observed daily routines, security procedures, personnel movements. If anyone would notice someone gathering intelligence or acting suspiciously, it would be you." Maya's mind raced through 3 years of observations. 3 years of being invisible while others assumed she wasn't listening, wasn't understanding, wasn't paying attention to details that mattered. She had seen everything, heard everything, filed away thousands of small details that had seemed insignificant at the time, but might now form patterns that revealed betrayal. "There were irregularities," Maya said slowly, "pieces of memory assembling themselves into disturbing configurations. People who asked questions that seemed innocent but weren't quite right. Conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. Personnel who showed up in areas they didn't normally access." "Can you be more specific?" Martinez asked, leaning forward. With the intensity of someone who understood that Maya's observations might be the key to preventing future attacks, Maya closed her eyes and let her memory work, sorting through 3 years of invisible observation with the analytical skills that had made her an effective intelligence operative before shame drove her into hiding. Names, faces, conversations, anomalies, all of it filtered through the paranoid awareness that every soldier developed in hostile territory. "Staff Sergeant Michael Torres from Communications," Maya said, opening her eyes to meet Martinez's gaze. 6 months ago, he started asking me questions about range security procedures, wanted to know when different units scheduled training, seemed very interested in which weapons were stored where. He said it was for efficiency study, but communications personnel don't normally conduct security assessments. Harrison was taking rapid notes, his expression growing darker with each detail Maya provided. "What else?" Corporal Janet Webb from Supply. "She's been photographing the equipment layouts in the weapons storage areas. Said it was for inventory purposes, but she was using a personal camera instead of official equipment. And she was taking pictures of security measures, not just weapons inventory." Maya continued for 20 minutes, detailing observations that painted a picture of systematic intelligence gathering by personnel who had legitimate access but suspicious motivations. The invisible range cleaner had been perfectly positioned to notice patterns that security officers might miss, to observe behavior that seemed normal to casual observation, but revealed deeper purposes to trained analysis. When Maya finished her recitation, the room was silent except for the hum of recording equipment and the scratch of Harrison's pen on paper. Martinez and her team were processing the implications of having multiple potential traitors within their ranks, people who had exploited their colleagues' trust to enable an attack that could have killed dozens of innocent soldiers. "Captain Chen," Martinez said finally, her voice carrying the weight of command decisions that would affect multiple careers and lives. "Your observations have provided us with leads that could prevent future attacks and expose a security breach that threatens every person on this base. But more than that, your actions last night demonstrated courage, skill, and character that this military needs." Maya felt her throat tighten with emotions she had thought buried too deep to resurrect. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of being told she wasn't worthy of wearing a uniform, wasn't trustworthy enough to be called a soldier, wasn't brave enough to make the hard choices that military service demanded. "Ma'am," Maya said, not trusting herself to say more. Martinez smiled, and Maya saw respect in her expression, not the careful politeness she had received as a contractor, but the genuine regard one warrior offered another. "I'm recommending you for immediate commissioning in the United States Army, Captain Chen. Your skills, your character, and your courage are exactly what we need in our officer corps." The offer hit Maya like lightning, illuminating possibilities she had thought lost forever. A chance to be a soldier again, to wear a uniform with pride rather than shame, to serve with people who valued conscience as much as competence. It was everything she had thought she would never be offered again, everything she had convinced herself she didn't deserve, but it was also terrifying. Accepting would mean abandoning the safe invisibility she had cultivated, would mean exposing herself to judgment and expectations and the possibility of failing again. It would mean trusting that her character was stronger than her fear, that her courage was deeper than her shame. Maya thought of her grandfather's compass, still warm against her chest, carrying the weight of family honor and military tradition. Into this moment of choice, Lei Chun had fought his war with conviction rather than convenience, had chosen sides based on principle rather than politics, had understood that true courage meant standing for something, even when standing was dangerous. "I accept, ma'am," Maya said, her voice steady with the confidence of someone who had finally made peace with her own choices. "I'm ready to be a soldier again." 6 months after the attack, Maya stood in the same observation deck where she had reclaimed her identity, but everything else had changed. The bullet holes in the walls had been repaired, the shattered windows replaced, the blood stains scrubbed away until no evidence remained of the night when death had walked through the corridors and been turned away by skill and courage. But the invisible scars remained in the memories of those who had survived, in the families who had lost loved ones to betrayal, in the knowledge that safety was always an illusion maintained by the vigilance of those willing to fight for it. Captain Maya Xin no longer hiding behind a contractor's anonymity but wearing the uniform of the United States Army with newly earned insignia, was conducting advanced marksmanship training for a group of soldiers who had requested her specifically. Word of her actions during the attack had spread through military channels with the persistence of legend, transforming her from invisible range cleaner to respected instructor in the space. Between one trigger pull and the next, Rodriguez had returned to active duty with a Purple Heart and a story he told with the enthusiasm of someone who had looked death in the face and lived to laugh about it. His daughter's latest drawing, a crayon masterpiece, depicting a female soldier with a rifle saving stick figure soldiers from stick figure bad guys, was framed on Maya's desk, a reminder that heroism sometimes lived in the eyes of children, who understood courage better than adults who complicated it with politics and procedure. Williams had grown up in the months since the attack, had shed his homesick boyishness and developed the quiet confidence of someone who had faced combat, and discovered reserves of strength he hadn't known he possessed. He still wrote letters to his mother on actual paper, but now those letters carried stories of pride rather than fear, of serving under an officer who had taught him that doing the right thing was sometimes more important than following orders. Brooks had been promoted to staff sergeant and transferred to a specialized trauma unit where her skills at treating combat injuries could serve soldiers across multiple theaters of operation. But she still visited Maya whenever her duties brought her back to the base, still shared the easy camaraderie of warriors who had bled together in the crucible of actual combat. Their friendship had been forged in violence, but tempered in mutual respect. Two women who had proven that courage wasn't limited by gender, that skill wasn't diminished by conscience. That sometimes the most important battles were fought by people nobody expected to be heroes. Morrison had recovered from his injuries and returned to active deployment, but not before recommending Maya for the Bronze Star and writing a letter of support for her commission that had been so persuasive it became part of her permanent record. His rifle, the Remington M24, that had been her instrument of redemption, now carried a small engraving on its stock, property of Captain Chen, guardian angel. Morrison claimed it was a joke, but Maya had seen him touch the engraving like a talisman before important missions. The investigation into the security breach had exposed a network of insider threats that reached deeper into the base's infrastructure than anyone had imagined. Torres and Webb had been the visible elements of a conspiracy that included personnel from communications, supply, and even military police soldiers who had been recruited by foreign intelligence services or terrorist organizations, who had sold their colleagues' lives for money or ideology or simple resentment against a military that hadn't given them what they thought they deserved. Maya's observations had been crucial in unraveling the conspiracy. Her 3 years of invisible vigilance providing investigators with leads that traditional security measures had missed. The range cleaner who nobody noticed had been perfectly positioned to observe patterns that trained intelligence officers might have overlooked, to recognize anomalies that seemed normal to casual observation, but revealed treacherous purposes. To analytical scrutiny, the trials had been swift and decisive. Torres received life imprisonment for treason. Webb was executed for providing intelligence that directly resulted in American casualties, and 6 other conspirators faced varying sentences ranging from lengthy prison terms to dishonorable discharge and civilian prosecution. Maya had testified at each trial, her quiet recitation of observed facts providing the foundation for convictions that sent a clear message. Betraying fellow soldiers carried consequences that no ideology or payment could justify, but the most significant change had been in Maya herself. The shame that had driven her into exile for 3 years had been replaced by quiet confidence. The self-doubt that had made her question every decision had been tempered by the knowledge that courage was not the absence of fear, but action taken despite fear. She had learned to sleep without checking locks twice, to trust her instincts without second-guessing every choice, to wear her uniform with pride rather than apology. Maya's new assignment was to develop training programs that would prepare soldiers for the kind of moral complexity she had faced in Taiwan situations where following orders might conflict with following conscience, where military discipline might demand actions that violated fundamental human decency. The Army had recognized that modern warfare required warriors who could think as well as fight, who could navigate ethical gray areas without losing their moral compass, who could choose the harder right over the easier wrong, even when authority figures pressured them to compromise their principles. The training was challenging, controversial, and absolutely necessary. Maya designed scenarios that forced soldiers to confront the difference between lawful orders and legal orders, between military discipline and blind obedience, between patriotism and nationalism. She taught them that the strongest soldiers were those who could say no to authority when authority was wrong, who could choose conscience over convenience even when that choice carried personal costs. Some officers resisted her approach, argued that military effectiveness required unquestioning obedience, that soldiers who hesitated to follow orders would get people killed in combat situations. Maya responded to these critics with the patient persistence of someone who had learned that true strength came from moral clarity rather than moral flexibility. She had killed enemies to protect innocent people, had saved lives by refusing to take them, had proven that conscience and capability were not mutually exclusive but mutually reinforcing. Maya's most challenging student was Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, Colonel Martinez's daughter, fresh from West Point and eager to prove herself in her mother's shadow. The younger Martinez had inherited her mother's intelligence and determination. but lacked the combat experience that had taught the colonel to value moral courage as much as physical bravery. She questioned Maya's teaching methods, argued that battlefield conditions left no room for ethical hesitation, insisted that soldiers who prioritized conscience over orders would fail when their comrades needed them most. "Ma'am, Lieutenant," Martinez said during one particularly heated training session, with respect, "your approach seems designed to create soldiers who won't follow orders. How do we maintain unit cohesion and tactical effectiveness if everyone is making individual moral judgments?" Maya had faced this question dozens of times from dozens of students, but she answered it with the same patient conviction she brought to every teaching moment. "Lieutenant, unit cohesion comes from shared values, not blind obedience. When soldiers trust that their leaders will never ask them to do something morally wrong, they will follow those leaders anywhere. But when soldiers are expected to compromise their conscience for convenience, that trust breaks down and the unit becomes vulnerable to the kind of corruption we saw here 6 months ago." The training room was silent as Maya's words settled over the assembled officers. These were career soldiers, people who had dedicated their lives to military service, but they were also human beings who understood the weight of moral choice in extreme circumstances. Maya's story had become part of base legend, but her teaching made it clear that every soldier might face similar choices, might be forced to choose between authority and ethics in situations where the wrong choice could haunt them forever. The strongest military units in history have been those where soldiers fought for something greater than themselves. Maya continued. They fought for principles worth dying for comrades worth protecting, for values worth preserving. When we ask soldiers to compromise those principles for tactical convenience, we weaken the very foundation that makes them willing to sacrifice for something larger than their own survival. Lieutenant Martinez was quiet for a long moment, processing Maya's words with the serious attention they deserved. Finally, she asked the question that Maya had been waiting for. How do we know when orders are wrong? How do we make those moral judgments under pressure? Maya smiled, recognizing the moment when theoretical resistance gave way to genuine inquiry. We know because we've trained our conscience as carefully as we've trained our shooting. We've studied the laws of war, the principles of human rights, the difference between protecting innocent people and harming them. And when the moment comes, and it will come for every soldier eventually, we trust that training to guide us toward choices we can live with. The class ended with more questions than answers, which Maya considered a success. Soldiers who left her training with comfortable certainties were soldiers who hadn't truly grappled with the complexities they would face in real combat situations. But soldiers who left with thoughtful uncertainty, with tools for making moral decisions under pressure, with confidence in their ability to navigate ethical gray areas, those soldiers would be prepared for whatever challenges awaited them. After the class dismissed, Maya walked to the window that overlooked the courtyard where she had ended 9 lives to save 4. The burned wreckage of the Humvee had been cleared away, the bullet holes in the concrete had been patched, the blood stains had been scrubbed clean. But Maya could still see the ghost images of that night, could still remember the weight of each decision, the mathematics of violence that had transformed her from invisible cleaner to visible warrior. Her grandfather's compass hung now in her office, displayed beside her commendations and the photograph Rodriguez's daughter had drawn. The inscription on its back, "For the warrior who finds her way home," had been added by a Chinese engraver in town who specialized in military memorabilia. Maya had thought the sentiment overly dramatic when she commissioned it, but now she understood its truth. Home wasn't a place but a state of being, the confidence that came from making peace with difficult choices, the strength that came from accepting responsibility for moral decisions, the courage that came from standing for principles even when standing was dangerous. That Maya was home now, no longer hiding from who she was, but embracing who she had always been. Captain Maya Chen, United States Army, instructor of marksmanship and conscience, guardian of principles worth fighting for. warrior who had found her way back to herself through the crucible of combat and the validation of respect earned through courage demonstrated under fire. But even as Maya stood in her office, surrounded by evidence of her reclaimed identity and reconstructed career, she knew that her real legacy would not be measured in commendations or promotions, but in the soldiers she taught, the principles she defended, the moral courage she modeled. For a new generation of warriors who would face their own impossible choices in their own moments of testing, the work was far from over. In fact, Maya realized it was just beginning. 3 years later, Major Maya Chen stood on the observation deck of the new regional training center that bore her grandfather's name, the late Chen Center for Military Ethics, watching the first graduating class of the Moral Courage Leadership Program receive their certificates. The facility had been built with funding from Congress members who had read her story, from veterans organizations that understood the need for ethical training, from foreign allies who wanted their officers trained in the same principles that had produced the guardian angel of phobe valor. The irony wasn't lost on Maya that she was now visible in ways she could never have imagined during her 3 years of hiding. Her story had been featured in military journals, studied in war colleges, referenced in Senate hearings about military ethics. The woman who had once swept floors in anonymity now briefed generals, testified before congressional committees, and consulted with foreign militaries, seeking to strengthen their own ethical training programs. But visibility brought responsibility. Maya received letters daily from soldiers facing moral dilemmas, from veterans struggling with choices they had made in combat, from young officers seeking guidance about navigating the complex relationship between duty and conscience. Each letter reminded her that her experience had become larger than herself, that her choice to stand rather than hide had created ripples that reached soldiers she would never meet, in conflicts she would never see, facing decisions that would define their own character and legacy. Rodriguez had risen to Sergeant First Class and was now Maya's senior instructor, teaching close-quarters combat with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything else. His daughter was 12 now, old enough to understand that her father's friend was famous, young enough to still draw pictures of Captain Maya for special occasions. The latest artwork showed Maya in dress uniform receiving a medal from the President Artistic License, since Maya had actually received her Distinguished Service Medal from the Secretary of Defense. But close enough to convey the child's sense that important people recognized her father's friend as a hero. Williams had completed college on military scholarship and returned as a second lieutenant, specifically requesting assignment to Maya's program. The homesick boy from Ohio had become a thoughtful young officer who understood that real strength came from moral clarity, rather than physical courage alone. He taught ethics seminars with the passion of someone who had learned these lessons through experience rather than theory, who could speak to young soldiers about fear and courage and the choices that defined character under pressure. Brooks had been promoted to major and now ran the military medical ethics program at Walter Reed, developing protocols for battlefield medicine that balanced tactical necessities with humanitarian obligations. She visited Maya quarterly, ostensibly for professional consultations, but really to maintain the friendship forged in combat, to share stories of challenges and victories with someone who understood the weight of moral leadership in military context. Morrison had retired from active duty and founded a private security firm that specialized in training corporate executives and diplomatic personnel in crisis response. But he donated half his time to Maya's program, teaching advanced marksmanship to officers who needed to understand not just how to shoot, but when shooting was justified. His rifle, the Remington M24, that had become Maya's instrument of transformation, was now permanently displayed in the center's museum, its stock bearing the inscription that had become the program's unofficial motto: "Property of those who guard the guardians." The traitors who had enabled the attack had faded into the background of military history, their names remembered only in security briefings and court records. Torres was serving his life sentence in federal prison, unrepentant to the end, insisting that his actions had been justified by American foreign policy failures and military imperialism. Webb had been executed 3 years earlier, taking her secrets to the grave rather than providing intelligence about her foreign contacts. The other conspirators had been scattered to various prisons and dishonorable discharges, their betrayal serving as cautionary tales about the corruption that could infect military institutions when moral leadership failed. But Maya had learned not to focus on the enemy she had defeated, but on the allies she had inspired. The program had trained over 800 officers in its 3 years of operation, and their stories were beginning to filter back through military channels. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Kim had refused orders to use torture during interrogations in Syria, choosing legal interviewing techniques that had actually produced better intelligence while maintaining American moral authority. Captain James Rodriguez, no relation to Maya's Rodriguez, had evacuated Afghan civilians during the withdrawal despite orders to prioritize American personnel only, saving 43 lives including a family with 3 children under the age of 5. Major Jennifer Martinez, the colonel's daughter who had once questioned Maya's teaching methods, had been awarded the Bronze Star for refusing to bomb a suspected terrorist safe house after intelligence revealed the presence of civilians, choosing instead to conduct a ground assault that captured the terrorists while protecting innocent lives. Her citation specifically mentioned the moral courage training she had received, making Maya's program the first ethics curriculum ever officially credited in a combat decoration. These stories validated Maya's belief that conscience and capability reinforced rather than undermined each other, that soldiers trained to think morally fought more effectively than those trained only to follow orders. The program's graduates had higher retention rates, better psychological health scores, and stronger unit cohesion ratings than control groups trained under traditional programs. Military effectiveness improved when soldiers trusted their leaders to never ask them to compromise their fundamental humanity. 5 years later, Colonel Maya Chen stood in the Pentagon briefing room, presenting her latest research to a joint session of military leadership and congressional oversight committees. The data was compelling. Units trained in moral courage principles had 23% fewer incidents of misconduct, 31% better performance ratings in complex combat situations, and 45% higher re-enlistment rates. More importantly, they had demonstrated superior tactical decision-making in morally ambiguous situations, proving that ethical training enhanced rather than hindered military effectiveness. The fundamental misunderstanding about military ethics, Maya told the assembled officials, is the assumption that moral reasoning slows down tactical decision-making. Our research proves the opposite. Soldiers trained to recognize ethical frameworks make faster, more effective decisions because they have internalized the principles that guide appropriate action. General Patricia Hayes, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, leaned forward with the attention of someone whose career had been built on understanding what worked in real combat situations. Colonel Chen, your program has produced impressive results, but some critics argue that this kind of training could create hesitation in combat situations where split-second decisions determine life and death. Maya had faced this question hundreds of times, but she answered it with the same conviction she brought to every challenge to her approach. General, hesitation comes from uncertainty about what's right. Our graduates don't hesitate because they've trained their moral compass as rigorously as their shooting. They know instantly whether a target is legitimate, whether force is justified, whether their actions align with the laws of war and American values. She clicked to the next slide, showing combat footage from recent operations where her graduates had made decisions under extreme pressure. Staff Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, no relation to my former colleague, faced an ambush in Somalia where enemy combatants were using civilians as human shields. Traditional training might have resulted in civilian casualties or tactical failure. Instead, Sergeant Rodriguez identified a flanking route that allowed her team to neutralize the threat without harming non-combatants, saving 12 civilian lives while eliminating the enemy threat. The footage was compelling. Rodriguez moving with fluid precision, communicating with hand signals that coordinated her team's advance, taking shots that required perfect accuracy to avoid hitting the civilians' position between her and legitimate targets. Maya had watched this footage dozens of times, had analyzed every decision Rodriguez made, had seen her own training reflected in the young sergeant's ability to maintain moral clarity while executing complex tactical maneuvers. This is what moral courage looks like in practice, Maya continued. Not hesitation, not weakness, not compromise of military effectiveness. This is enhanced capability through ethical clarity. Senator Robert Palmer, ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, studied his notes with the careful attention of someone whose political career depended on understanding military issues. Colonel Chen, your personal story has obviously influenced your approach to ethics training. How do you ensure that your program teaches universal principles rather than just your individual experience? Maya smiled at the question, recognizing both its legitimacy and its underlying skepticism. Senator, my experience taught me that moral courage is not situational, it's universal. Whether the pressure comes from foreign enemies or domestic authority figures, whether the stakes are individual careers or civilian lives, the principles remain constant. Protect innocent people, follow the laws of war, choose conscience over convenience. These aren't my personal values, they're the foundation of professional military service. She clicked to another slide showing testimonials from program graduates serving across multiple theaters of operation. Our curriculum is based on military law, international humanitarian standards, and constitutional principles. The scenarios we use are drawn from actual combat situations faced by American forces over the past 20 years. We're not teaching soldiers to think like me. We're teaching them to think like the best version of themselves. Congressman Michael Torres, no relation to the traitor who had once threatened the base, raised his hand with the skeptical expression of someone whose district included major defense contractors. Colonel, this ethical training sounds admirable in theory, but doesn't it risk creating soldiers who question legitimate orders? How do we maintain command authority if every soldier thinks they're qualified to make moral judgments? Maya had expected this question, had prepared for it with the same analytical thoroughness she brought to tactical planning. Congressman, command authority is strengthened when soldiers trust their leaders to never ask them to do something morally wrong. When that trust breaks down, when soldiers are asked to compromise their conscience for tactical convenience, command authority becomes fragile and dependent on fear rather than respect. She gestured toward the screen, showing statistics from the program's impact studies. Our graduates have higher confidence ratings in their leadership, stronger unit cohesion scores, and better performance evaluations than control groups. Follow orders more effectively because they trust those orders are legally and morally sound. The questions continued for 2 hours, covering everything from budget implications to implementation challenges to concerns about whether ethical training might conflict with combat effectiveness. Maya answered each query with data, examples, and the quiet confidence of someone whose theories had been tested in real combat by real soldiers facing real moral challenges. When the session ended, General Hayes approached Maya with the purposeful stride of someone who had made important decisions. Colonel Chen, I'm recommending your program for expansion to all combat units within 18 months. The results speak for themselves, and frankly, the military needs more leaders who understand. That strength comes from character, not just capability. Maya felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came with recognition from people whose opinions mattered. Thank you, General. I'm honored by your confidence. It's not confidence, Colonel, it's evidence. Your approach works because it's based on something our military has sometimes forgotten, that we serve principles larger than ourselves, that our strength comes from our values, not just our weapons. 10 years later, Brigadier General Maya Chen stood in the cemetery at Arlington National Station, placing a small Taiwanese flag beside her grandfather's compass on the grave of Lei Chen, who had finally been laid to rest in American soil beside his granddaughter's adopted homeland. The old man had lived to see Maya's promotion to general officer, had lived to see the military ethics program that bore his name become standard curriculum in military academies around the world, had lived to see his granddaughter transform from disgraced exile to honored leader. The funeral had been attended by hundreds of people, soldiers Maya had trained, officers whose careers had been shaped by her program, foreign military leaders who had implemented similar ethical training in their own forces. Rodriguez, now a command sergeant major, had served as honor guard. Williams, now a lieutenant colonel, had delivered a eulogy that spoke of courage transcending generations. Brooks, now a colonel herself, had flown in from Geneva, where she was developing international standards for military medical ethics. Morrison, gray-haired now but still carrying himself with the bearing of a warrior, had presented Maya with a flag folded with military precision. He would be proud, Morrison said simply. Lei Chen fought his war with honor, passed that honor to his granddaughter, and watched her change how warriors think about courage. Maya held the flag against her chest, feeling its weight as a connection to the grandfather who had taught her that moral courage was the foundation of all other courage, that a warrior's greatest victory was maintaining honor even when honor was difficult. Lei Chen had fought the Japanese with rifles and determination, had taught his granddaughter to shoot with precision and conscience, had guided her through 3 years of exile and back to herself through the compass that had carried family history into American military tradition. The program now trained over 10,000 officers annually, had been adopted by NATO allies, had influenced military doctrine in countries Maya had never visited. The principles her grandfather had taught during mountain walks in Taiwan now guided soldiers in Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, and peacekeeping missions across 6 continents. Moral courage had become a force multiplier, proof that warriors fought most effectively when they fought for something worthy of their sacrifice. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. But Maya's greatest pride came not from the scope of the program's influence, but from the individual stories of soldiers who had faced their own moments of moral testing and chosen courage over convenience. Captain David Kim had refused orders to abandon wounded civilians during an evacuation in South Sudan, organizing a rescue operation that saved 47 lives while maintaining mission security. Major Jennifer Brooks had exposed corruption in the military supply chain, risking her career to ensure that substandard equipment didn't reach combat units where lives depended on quality gear. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez had perhaps faced the greatest test, confronting a superior officer who had ordered the execution of captured enemy combatants in violation of the Geneva Conventions. Martinez had not only refused the order, but documented the attempted war crime, testifying at the subsequent court-martial that had resulted in the superior's dismissal and imprisonment. Her courage had prevented an atrocity that would have damaged American military honor and possibly escalated regional conflicts. These stories multiplied across the years, creating a cascade of moral leadership that strengthened military institutions and enhanced American credibility in international operations. Soldiers trained in ethical decision-making became ambassadors for American values, proving through their actions that military strength and moral character reinforced rather than competed with each other. 15 years later, Lieutenant General Maya Chen stood on the balcony of her Pentagon office, watching the sun set over Washington, D.C. as she prepared for retirement after 35 years of military service, 8 in the Taiwanese military, 3 in exile, and 24 in the U.S. Army. Tomorrow she would transfer command of the Military Ethics Directorate to Colonel Sarah Martinez, Lei Chen's namesake who had grown from skeptical lieutenant to passionate advocate for moral courage training. Maya's office was filled with memorabilia from a career that had spanned disgrace and redemption, invisibility and recognition, exile and honor. Her grandfather's compass sat in a place of honor, beside the Presidential Medal of Freedom she had received for transforming military ethics training. Rodriguez's daughter's childhood drawings shared wall space with commendations from foreign heads of state. Morrison's rifle occupied a display case, across from testimonials from thousands of officers whose lives had been shaped by principles Maya had learned during mountain walks with an old soldier who understood that courage was a legacy passed from generation to generation. The knock on her door interrupted Maya's reflection, and she turned to see a young captain she didn't recognize. Asian features that suggested recent immigration, nervous energy that spoke of someone facing an important moment, hands that moved with the unconscious precision of someone trained in weapons handling. General Chen? I'm Captain Lisa Park, recently assigned to the ethics training program. I wanted to introduce myself before your retirement ceremony tomorrow. Maya studied the young officer, recognizing something familiar in her bearing. Captain Park, where did you serve before this assignment? South Korea, ma'am. I was with the Republic of Korea Army for 6 years before transferring to the U.S. military. Park's voice carried the slight hesitation of someone whose English was excellent, but not native. I requested this assignment specifically because of your program's reputation. Maya gestured for Park to sit, curious about the young officer's story. What made you interested in ethics training, Captain? Park's expression grew serious, and Maya recognized the look of someone carrying weight from difficult decisions. 2 years ago, I was ordered to fire on civilian protesters outside a U.S. military installation in Seoul. North Korean agitators had infiltrated the crowd, but the protesters themselves were just students concerned about American nuclear weapons deployment. Maya felt electricity run through her body as she recognized the parallel to her own experience. What did you do? I refused the order, ma'am. I identified the actual agitators and neutralized them with precision shots while avoiding civilian casualties. But my commanding officer labeled me insubordinate, said I was unreliable for questioning legitimate orders. Maya leaned forward, seeing her own journey reflected in the young captain's experience. How did you end up here? Park smiled, and Maya saw determination in her expression. I read about your story, ma'am. About how you chose conscience over career, about how you found your way back to service through moral courage. I realized that what I thought was the end of my military career might actually be the beginning of something more important. Maya felt the familiar tightness in her throat, but this time it was accompanied by something approaching joy. The cycle was continuing. The lessons were passing to a new generation. The principles her grandfather had taught during mountain walks were finding new voices to carry them forward. Captain Park, Maya said, her voice carrying the authority earned through years of moral leadership, I think you're going to fit in very well here. The program needs officers who understand that real strength comes from character, that real courage means standing for something, even when standing is difficult. Yes, ma'am, I'm ready to learn. Maya looked out her window at the setting sun, painting the sky in shades of gold and red that reminded her of Taiwanese mountains where an old soldier had once taught his granddaughter that courage was a compass that always pointed toward honor. Tomorrow she would retire, would pass her responsibilities to officers like Martinez and Park, who understood that military service was about protecting principles worth fighting for, about maintaining honor even when honor was challenging. Tonight, in the quiet of her Pentagon office, surrounded by memories of a career that had spanned disgrace and redemption, Maya Chen allowed herself to feel something she had thought lost forever during those 3 years of hiding: pride. Not the false pride of hidden superiority, but the genuine satisfaction of someone who had faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious. Not over enemies, but over her own fear. Not through violence, but through character. Not despite her conscience, but because of it. The invisible woman had become visible. The disgraced officer had become honored general. The range cleaner had become the guardian of military honor. And the compass her grandfather had given her continued to point toward true north, toward courage, toward character, toward the choice to stand when standing was hard. Maya picked up her grandfather's compass one final time, feeling its familiar weight in her palm. Tomorrow it would go to Captain Park, along with the responsibility to carry forward the lessons learned in mountain forests during a different war, proven in combat during a desperate night, refined through years of teaching soldiers that strength and morality were not enemies, but allies in the eternal struggle to protect what mattered most. The sun disappeared behind the horizon, and Maya Chen prepared to pass the watch to warriors who would face their own impossible choices, make their own difficult decisions, find their own way home through the compass of conscience that pointed always toward honor. 20 years later, final epilogue. The documentary crew had spent 3 days at the Li Chen Center for Military Ethics, interviewing graduates of the program who now served as generals, ambassadors, and leaders in fields ranging from international law to corporate security. The center had become a pilgrimage site for military professionals worldwide, a place where the principles of moral courage were studied, refined, and passed to new generations of warriors who understood that true strength came from character. Maya Chen, now 72 and long retired, sat in the same observation deck where she had once reclaimed her identity. Watching the latest class of officers practice the shooting techniques she had developed, precision marksmanship combined with ethical decision-making, technical skill merged with moral clarity, the ability to hit any target balanced with the wisdom to know which targets deserve to be hit. The interviewer, a young journalist whose grandfather had served in Vietnam, asked the question that everyone wanted answered. General Chen, looking back on your career, what do you think was your greatest accomplishment? Maya smiled, thinking of the thousands of officers who had carried her teachings into combat zones around the world, who had chosen courage over convenience in moments of testing, who had proven that moral warriors fought more effectively than amoral ones. She thought of the awards and recognitions, the foreign delegations that studied her methods, the military academies that taught courses based on her curriculum, but mostly she thought of individual moments. Rodriguez's daughter, drawing pictures of female soldiers, Williams finding courage in his conscience, Brooks choosing to heal rather than harm, Morrison trusting a disgraced range cleaner with his weapon and his life. She thought of Captain Park, now a general herself, continuing to teach that strength and morality reinforced each other. She thought of her grandfather's compass, now in a museum display, but still guiding soldiers who understood that courage was a legacy passed from warrior to warrior across generations. My greatest accomplishment, Maya said, her voice still steady, despite her age, was learning that hiding from yourself is the greatest defeat, and finding yourself is the greatest victory. Everything else, the program, the recognition, the impact on military doctrine, grew from that simple truth. The interviewer made notes, but Maya could see he was hoping for something more dramatic, more suitable for documentary narration. She smiled and continued, "But if you want something more concrete, my greatest accomplishment was proving that doing the right thing doesn't make you weak. It makes you stronger. That conscience and capability aren't enemies but allies. That the warrior's greatest weapon isn't the rifle in their hands, but the character in their heart." As the interview concluded and the crew packed their equipment, Maya remained in the observation deck, watching the sun set over the training ranges where a new generation of soldiers was learning the lessons she had paid for with 3 years of exile and reclaimed through 10 minutes of combat. The invisible woman had become a legend, but more importantly, the legend had become a legacy that would outlive the woman who created it. Maya touched the space over her heart where her grandfather's compass had once hung, feeling the warmth of memory and the weight of purpose fulfilled. Chen had fought his war with rifles and determination, had taught his granddaughter that courage was a compass pointing toward honor, had guided her through darkness back to light, through the simple understanding that doing right was worth any sacrifice. Now Maya was old, her duty done, her legacy secure in the hands of warriors who understood that strength came from character, that courage came from conscience, that the greatest victories were won not over enemies, but over the fear that kept good people from doing good things. When doing good things was difficult, the range fell quiet as training ended for the day. But Maya knew that somewhere in the world, a soldier trained in her methods was facing a moral choice, was using principles learned in her classrooms to navigate the complex terrain between duty and conscience, was proving once again that warriors fought most effectively when they fought for something worthy of their sacrifice. The invisible woman was visible no more, but her vision lived on in every officer who chose the harder right over the easier wrong, in every soldier who protected innocent people even when protection was difficult, in every warrior who understood that true strength came not from the power to destroy, but from the courage to preserve what mattered most. Chen had found her way home through the compass of conscience, and now that compass guided others toward the same destination, toward honor, toward character, toward the eternal truth that courage was not the absence of fear, but action taken despite fear, not the privilege of the fearless, but the responsibility of the faithful, not the luxury of the strong, but the duty of the just.